do a recorded broadcast. I got started.
Yeah.
So first, I want to say thank you to a couple different people. So those that don't know, our current director, Angela, is leaving at the end of this month, going to Johns Hopkins. Been a wonderful director. She's not here, but I just want to say thank you to her. And then we have an incoming interim director, Carrie, who was amazing, also not here. But she's wonderful and really has promoted our work and has made life just a lot easier for all of us. And then I really want to thank Gina and Erin, who are over there, who have helped put this on in my very disorganized way. If it weren't for them folding chairs, hand signs, what they want to be talking. Anyway, okay, enough of the stand-up routine. So I'm very excited to have Marc and Jerusalem join us today. For those that don't know, I'm sure you all do know, Marc has written a wonderful book, Why Nothing Works, a really quite a good title. And it's sort of tracing the history of progressivism and why it's so difficult to do stuff. A lot of the research that I do and my group does is about why it's so hard and expensive to build transit projects. That's how Marc and I started talking. And so over the years, we discussed a lot of these ideas about fragmentation, centralization, MIPA, all the good things that I'm sure they will talk about today. And so I'm very excited for him to talk about the book. It's a real celebration. Writing a book, there are a lot of other academics here, I'm sure. It's really hard. I've never done it, so I'm always sort of in awe of those that do it. And then Jerusalem is here too. Also has written a book, also for sale outside. She's sort of covered this stuff, on the journalism side, done a wonderful job sort of laying bare, I would say, sort of all the problems of NIMBYism and how it sort of gums up everything from building housing to building subways to tree maintenance in your neighborhood, DC. But without that, I'll sort of hand it over to them, to the pros. They're going to talk and entertain us and educate us. So please welcome Marc Dunkelman and Jerusalem Demsas. All right.
Well, I'm the one who bought the book. Marc says you don't have to read it, you can buy it.
That's right.
So, you have it on your way up.
But you do have to buy and read.
That's true.
Yes.
It's much shorter, so it's. So I want to start with the moment that we're in right now. A big part of your book is a critique of fragmentation, of localism, and also seeing how that's in tension with other parts of liberalism and progressive. And I think a lot of people might have been open to this in October 2024.
Yeah.
And then the next month, someone came into office, who will not be named, who is someone who wants to use the powers of government against a lot of things that book you say you stand for. And so I want to ask you about how you balance this desire for centralization to make government capable of doing big things with the fact that sometimes people get into power who are going to do big bad things.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's exactly, you've got exactly the problem that I'm trying to solve. My premise is that if you make it so hard for anything to get done, you're almost inevitably going to get something bad come in and try to blow up the whole system. And so that's sort of the trick here is we had a system, progressivism built between the late 1800s and 50s, 1960s, where we gave a lot of discretion, generally to white men wearing gray suits. And it all, what was it? The blue suit for your information. But our idea, our central narrative that power was too diffuse, was caught up in machine politics and trusts and corporate. We were going to put it in the hands of centralized bureaucratic experts. We're going to use scientific reasoning to do the right thing in public interest. And then we realized sort of in the late 60s, like early 70s, that actually these fedora wearing, gray suited establishment experts weren't always getting the right answers to big questions. They were doing different renewal, they were putting DD DDT on crops, creating birth defects. They were gangs in the Vietnam War. They were sending plumbers into Watergate, like in all sorts of realms of American life, establishment that. So we put out a whole bunch of checks on it. This is all about your research, but a lot of my research. What's clear is that from the late 60s, early 70s until really today, progressivism has taken a different narrative. It's not that power, it's that there's two kinds. That there are these powerful figures in various dark places in American society who are making decisions. We need to somehow thwart the coercive behavior towards ordinary people. So the sort of the centralized mantra of progressivism, speak truth, has become our way of thinking. And we've so thoroughly spoken truth to power in every realm that now it's almost impossible for anybody to do anything, such that you end up with a frustrated public who will say, look, these people are completely out of line. And I'm going to put in somebody who's just going to smash this. And that was the central promise, value proposition from scanners.
And you actually have a story that you have at the beginning of the introduction that speaks to this quite directly. So what can you tell it about the ice rink?
So, some folks in here will know that there is a beautiful little ice skating rink in Central Park called Bowman Rink, sort of not far from the plaza near the zoo, southeastern corner. It was built in the 50s, sort of years of New York City in the post-war, and it fell apart in the late 70s. And Mayor Koch decided he was going to redo it. So he decides we're going to rip up the Bowman Rink, we're going to replace it. Not only are we going to replace it, we're going to improve it by, instead of having brine, how they generally use, they're going to use freon, or they can use chemical. And so he rips it up, and then at that point, the Parks Department, which is going to sign this job, realizes there's an old law called the Wicks Law, which the state government passed decades earlier to ensure against municipal corruption. So the notion was that the mayor of Schenectady, or one of those towns up in a faraway place, they would do the mayor would decide to do some sort of bullshit contract that wasn't for a project that wasn't necessary and give the work to his brother. So it was, and so their solution to that was in any contract of any size, they would split the work between a different concrete person, an electrical person, a plumbing person. You split it up so that there'd be some visibility. So the Parks Department here in New York realizes that they have to first figure out who's going to excavate the old rink, and they have to build the pipes, and they have to do electrical, they have to do these in sequence. And it takes so long for them to do that by the time several years later and a few $1 million extra, they switch on the ice rink to freeze the new water, it doesn't work. And so Koch is humiliated, and what's he going to do? And he's got to go, hey, he can't. So he's about to have to tell New York that they're going to have to redo this work. New York is terrible financial state. And he lucks out, he gets a letter from a developer. He says, listen, Ed, this is not a hard job. And I will do it for you. I will do the whole thing. If it costs more, I'll pay the overage. If it takes longer, I'll cover the additional frustrations. Just give it to me, pay me the set price. I'll get it done and I'll hand it back to you, no problem. And Koch, who's had wanted this to be sort of a feather in his cap kind of moment, then fine, like let's do that. And so all those things happen. They hand the developer, he does the work, the ice cream opens, they interview someone the next day who's skating on the rink, and they say, what do you think? And he says, I'm just amazed because anyone who's able to do anything in the city, 1985, anyone who's able to do anything in the city deserves a ticker tape. Who was the developer? Donald Trump.
Getting his parade.
He's getting his parade. So decades later. So what I took from that was that he's been running this game now for the better part of. He realized that even here in the most liberal city, people had a pretty negative view of actual government. They didn't feel the government actually. They were eager for someone to just, sort of push through the mishigas of, what it is to go to the Department of Motor Vehicles the first day. You come in with 3 proofs of where you live, and they say, no, I actually need 4, and so now you have to go back to your apartment. That is what people, that is in their mind what government is. in many cases, it is with government, right? As your reporting reveals, like in the world of housing, like if you want to build a house in a place where it's zoned, or you want upzoned, or whatever, all sorts of situations, like the government does not feel like it's on your side in any way. It's just sort of a mud bath that you have to run through. And so Trump has sort of figured out that people of all sorts have this feeling about government. Even people who don't share his misogyny or his racism or his, penchant for fraud or any of these things. They like this notion that he's going to break through the morass of government. And so my view is that his election in 2024 is sort of getting the better of Ed Koch on Goldman Rink. They are echoes, but born from the same broad-based frustration about how government does.
So there are a lot of, can everyone in the back hear us? Okay, great. There are a lot of anti-corruption measures that are put in place by the original progressive movement in order to prevent a lot of like rampant, awful corruption we were seeing in cities across this nation in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yep.
And many of those anti-corruption methods were transparency efforts, and a lot of them were hamstringing the ability of government to make decisions without studies and input, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I wonder, the story that you tell, and sorry if you're hearing from like yours, is maybe corruption is an inherent part of a development process. Is there something here where it's just like, you see this happening in countries all over the world where you see building quickly. You see quite a bit of things that maybe we've got, like all of the contractors or people who are related to the mayor, all of the people who have access to even making bids and are often individuals who have greater market power already because of their positioning. And so I wonder, do you think that that's just something we need to have higher tolerance for? There's going to be some, we have corruption already in the city. Maybe they'll build some housing too.
Nicely put. I guess I think that there's a term here that we're losing. We go from morass to corruption. Those are almost as if those are two options. But the element that is distinct, I think that there's actually some disagreement within our world of abundance. People who are the sort of supply side, progressivism that builds, the community that's growing around these ideas. That the thing, in my view, that is missing in these cases is the question of discretion. Like at the end of the day, if you're going to build it, you need to build it one side of the river to the other, and the pedestal has to be a pedestal for both sides. And there's no perfect place that will have no external costs beyond the cost of the pedestal. Like someone's home is going to be taken, someone's school is going to be shadowed, someone's commute is going to be lengthened, some neighborhood is going to. And the question is, who gets to decide where the pedestal is going to be? Like and like that's a hard thing to do. In the moment that it is determined where the pedestal is going to be, the people who are disadvantaged by that choice claim that it's correct, right? Like it's a natural thing. And in fact, we have since the 60s and 70s incented them to do that. Like we've created mechanisms whereby they say, you didn't study this, you didn't consider this, like there's disparate impact on this community. So like we've created all sorts of ways for people to complain about when to shroud their disagreement with the final decision in a whole series of various legitimate claims. And so our presumption is when we don't like the outcome, that the process was corrupt. I think like I'm going to go on record as saying I am anti-corruption. Right here and now, you can quote it, and if you sweep the stories, please put me down on that side of the corruption issue. But I also think that we ought to thinking about generally take away the question of power, of corruption, of process, of environmental impacts, of endangered species, all of it. who in the end should get to decide what gets done?
What do you think?
Well, I think it should be someone, and I say that I'm rare in our breed of believing it should be someone. I think that you know, there's a guy at NYU who has written an article, an influential article called The Procedure Fetish. Nick Bagley is his name, will come out with a great book next year, for sure. Well, what did I say? Oh, sorry.
You're just
Originally,
Originally.
Originally, he's an NYU law grad, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. And Nick's book will be terrific, I'm sure, but the notion of the procedure fetish, whether it's a fetish or not, the notion that we seem to have embraced as progressives is that if you create the right procedure, we'll get an outcome that everyone can agree with. And that's just not how these things work. Like, you're just not going to be able to find some way to build the high voltage transmission line across all of Maine and find that all of Maine supports it. Same with high-speed rail lines, same with housing. Everybody supports more housing. Nobody wants more housing right here. And so the question is, who should get to decide whether the housing gets built or doesn't get built? Should the neighborhood get to decide? Should the state get to decide? Should the locality get to decide? And I think it probably varies from one place to the next, but it's something that progressives almost never think about, because they think that there is some process that if you just put in the inputs, it will spit out a decision that is fair and that everyone will welcome. And that's politics is making these hard decisions, saying you're going to be a winner in this one, and you're going to be a loser. We all got to live with it.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the great central points of your work, which is there actually is a trade-off that actually has to happen at the end of the day. And I in energy, this is where it's abundantly clear. Not to overuse that word,
Yeah.
but
On the mind.
it's on the mind.
Yeah.
Where there was a study that came out around how by Leah Stokes at UC Santa Barbara around where the siting of wind farms were in North America and how much opposition they were likely to get. And she was tracking what kinds of communities were likely to come out in opposition, how they would register their opposition. And one thing that she noted in her work is, she's progressive, and she said, you actually reduce opposition by instituting community benefits agreement. And then I asked her to run the analysis for me that when the median size of a project between one without a community benefits agreement and one with. And it went from I don't remember, it was a few dozen windmills to two windmills was the median size of the project that went through a community benefit agreement. The meaning there is that, yes, you can take away all the opposition by basically not building the project, but there is a trade-off there that's important to deal with. And there are these empirical questions about, there are places where wind is really plentiful and places where not. It's not equal where you put wind, but it has to go in certain locations.
Yeah.
Sun shines more in some places than others, and these are all trade-offs. Doesn't mean you have to paper the entirety of our national parks with solar, but there has to be some empirical agreement that someone's going to be unhappy. And one thing I wanted to ask you about is, to me, when I'm in a bad mood, when I read these books, it makes me feel very hopeless, because it is this, the central critique around diffuse benefits and concentrated costs. It leads you to believe, I guess nothing is gonna really happen then, because the constituency for taking away individual people's ability to object to local projects is the people in this room. That's the whole thing. So when you're working on this.
My parents are always.
Oh, yeah. But you have to.
Yeah.
And I wonder, when you're looking through these issues, do you feel like it's a hopeless project here, or we're just sort of pushing against inertia, political inertia, or is there some actual path out of the wilderness?
So when I'm asked that question, which comes up frequently, I think about sort of the very beginning of progressivism was born in the industrial age, the moment when power was very diffused, like it is today. There were machines, basically they represented the working class, there were courts, they basically represented the landed elite. There was barely a middle class. Middle class emerges and says to themselves, I don't like the way that society is constructed when machines, courts are basically at odds. Can't get good sewage systems, we can't get good transit systems, we can't build electricity at scale. Like there are all these things that should be done in a way that is centralized, like where expertise. And you read, there's a great book by a Georgetown law professor, Brad Snyder, called House of Truth, which is about this house on 19th Street in DuPont Circle in Washington, where a bunch of sort of young people your age, met and lived and sort of thought to themselves in their frustration, like, what could we do to fix this? They were the young progressives. It was Felix Frankfurter, it was Walter Lippmann, it was a bunch of other folks who have been more lost in history than even they. And their view was like, you know, how are we going to get past this impossible Supreme Court? How are we going to get past the doctrine that the courts can get involved in economics? So Lochner, how are we? It seemed like a gigantic task that we would never be able to centralize power in a way that would allow for the sort of the development of the country that they believe needed to happen. You know, 50 years later, Robert Moses is running highways across New York City, right? And there are similar figures all over the country. And you've got Robert McNamara, you know, sending us to Vietnam. Like there are powerful figures who make big decisions all over the place, and there's almost no accountability. So we went from one extreme to the other. And now here we are almost back where we've got, once again, powers fused. It's almost impossible to get things done. I mean, you can almost hear echoes of the conversations we were having in the House in 1908 in the conversations having now. So it is impossible from one moment to the next, one era to the next, to imagine there will ever be another regime, right? It'd be impossible at the height of Robert Moses' power, where he is plowing across South Bronx, Bronx Expressway, and doing things that everyone screams no at him. And he's just this imperious figure in an office you can't get to on Randall's Island. And like, and the same with Richard Daley, or you know the boss hogs who across the South. Like these figures were completely imperious and completely insulated, and like we don't have figures like that anymore. So it was possible at their height to imagine this, and it's impossible now to imagine that there will be some new regime 30 or 40 years. But the truth is, like, there's just no alternative to us figuring out some way to be able to build housing again. We've done to build rail systems. We had, you know, in the early 1900s, we had the world's envy of a rail system. Now, of course, you know, everyone goes to Europe or to and says, you know, America can't keep up, but like, it's not like we can't do this. In all these realms, we've switched up the system. And like, you know, founders, whether it was wisdom or happenstance, created a system that allows for this pendulum to swing between a very Hamiltonian, centralized approach to solving problems to one that's very Jeffersonian with lots of stuff. So I am not hopeless at all. I find, like, you know, your book came out, Jen Paulka's book came out, Ezra and Derek's book Abundance came out, Yoni Applebaum's book, stuff like there's a growing literature focused on this. And I mean, I would love to tell you that I think that my book is, you know, had a lot of big ideas, but like there's a lot of stuff that's super obvious in there, it just hadn't been written down. And I just think that once people see it, it's hard to unsee it. Like we've made a choice to make it hard to do things like this. And we can make a choice about it.
You mentioned two words that appear a lot in your book, Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian. And I want you to define what those two things are. And then, well, change it to a question. Apparently that's bad interviewing.
No.
So
Okay.
first you define it for us.
Okay, so let's define the two. So at the beginning of the Republic, there are these figures people are broadly aware of. Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson. They have two different fears that sort of speak to their approach to building the Republic. Alexander Hamilton's fear is that America, which he believes could be a Hercules, that the challenge will be centralizing power so that big things can happen. So he wants financial capital, he wants like an imperial presidency, he wants, you know, almost dictatorial powers. I'm overstating that, but like his fear is a diffusion of power so that America can't reach its full potential. things like financiers and politicians and experts ought to have a disproportionate amount of power in the republic as it grows. Jefferson's fear is exactly the opposite. His fear is of centralized power because he's afraid that the central, like the monarchy in the years in the colonial era, like the monarchy, there would be some domestic king who would be oppressing, white landed gentry. And so his view is, how do you use power? So these are two different ideas that, and Jefferson and Hamilton have their own peccadillos and their own conversations. There's more to that history, but the book is centered in the tension between this idea that as you look at the world, is the solution going to be found power up, the hands of some expert who can do big things, pushing it down so that ordinary people are not oppressed or coerced by someone at the top. And that from the very beginning of the progressive movement, which is 100 years after Hamilton and Jefferson live and have their influence, that is the central tension within the early progressives, is that there is some portion of the movement that is fundamentally Jeffersonian. Many people know that Louis Brandeis, who was sort of an early progressive, that he was obsessed with this notion of bigness and wanted to keep things small. He had an vision that in the rise of industrialization could return power to ordinary citizens and that small businesses could compete with the big trusts. So he wanted to keep things small. So he was sort of a big advocate. His acolytes, many of them were acolytes, were sort of modern day or progressive era advocates of Jeffersonians. And so that would meant Sherman Antitrust Act, and to keep up the Sherman Antitrust Act, and trying to use what power there was to keep things small, to push power down. And there was then within the same movement people who were fundamentally Hamiltonian, and their view was that we've got these huge trusts, and we shouldn't break up Standard Oil, or we shouldn't break up US Steel. What we should do is create a big, robust government bureaucracy that can regulate. And you see the sort of the opening story of the opening chapter of the book is a fight within the Progressive Party you mentioned in 1912 between these two camps. And there's a stolen platform. I tried to diffuse it with a bunch of personal drama with some of them. But I tried to convince. So my general notion is that from the very beginning of progressivism until today, these two ideas, a narrative that power is too weak, we should push it up, or the idea that power is too clustered, we should push it down. They are in every progressive party, in every progressive mind. It is not that the moderates are Hamiltonian and the left is Jeffersonian, is that both of them have impulses where they say to themselves, clearly on climate change, we need to have a Hamiltonian solution. Someone needs to tell these big leaders they need to stop emitting. Clearly on reproductive rights, their view is Jeffersonian because their view is that some bureaucrat shouldn't be telling a woman what to do with her body. So like most progressives or almost all progressives have these impulses in their minds and hearts and aren't even aware they are struggling with a conflict. And so, I mean, the basic arc of the book, maybe it's the second part of your question. Basic arc of the book is that the Hamiltonian approach, which existed at the beginning, really predominates from the 1890s until the 1970s. There's a Jeffersonian element throughout, but it's really Hamiltonian when we want to build big bureaucracies, want to use government to regulate things, want government to be robust. And then we see what's happening in Vietnam with DDT, with urban renewal, and the movement pivots become Jeffersonian, so that, as we said before, the sort of abiding ethos of progressives becomes speaking truth to power, which would have been completely foreign to the progressives of the 1900s, the 1950s era. Like speaking truth to power, like you look at the video of the 1968 DNC, you've got the Jeffersonians, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin marching outside, and then you've got Richard Daley inside. And that is about as good a split as you'll see of a Hamiltonian and Daley and LBJ, Hubert Humphrey, people who really believe that government can be this robust institution that can help people, and the people outside seeing government. And eventually, I think, in my view, the marchers, by the time you get to the mid-70s, Gary Hart is running for Senate, and the Watergate people, whatnot. The outside world, progressivism becomes what the marchers. I got into a Ben Smith column early on in the publicity tour that I think that Robert Caro, who everyone here knows, who wrote The Power Broker, is actually Abby Hoffman in a tweet jacket. Just in the sense that it's this, the Power Broker sort of launders the notion of the new left into academia, not in a bad way. But he's taking an ethos that was familiar to people who were against the war and for civil rights and with the counterculture, and applies it in beautiful stories in a way that makes it palatable inside the
That was good. It wasn't a good question.
Oh, all right.
So I'm not.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you about this is I had not read any of your work. And I knew that someone was writing a book called Why Nothing Works. It was about the tension between Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians. I would have assumed that this is a book and a project focused on the conservative and as well as liberal impulses within American society. Because as you know well, there are a lot of conservative pushes to reduce government power. Probably even the dominant one we consider the federal government. And that conservatives wanted to hamstring government, like Reagan era, et cetera, like not wanted to be able to tax highly, to be able to have a lot of discretion. They wanted to hamstring the ability of agencies to make decisions. Even right now, we're seeing this in the Supreme Court, conservative impulses to, not in all cases, but conservative impulses to reduce agency discretion in many situations. And I guess what is the reason to situate this as a fight within liberalism rather than to focus on the ways that conservatism has been kind of dominating force? Because to me, when I come into contact with these Jeffersonians from the Democratic Party or within the progressive movement, I often view them as these are folks who have been captured by conservative ideas, whether they are folks who consider themselves degrowthers or individuals who are maybe for various things. I mean, not even in a pejorative way, but these are conservative ideas. These are quite literally like what conservatism is about. And so I guess talk me through why this is a book about liberalism, not a book about Republicans versus Democrats, liberals versus conservatives.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess because I wanted to write something new. There's a lot of literature about the right, and also because when the government doesn't work, it benefits the right politically. Like they can break things and then point to it and say, look, government doesn't work, and like that worked to their benefit. We as a movement believe in government. We believe, progressivism is saying, conservatism is, to quote Buckley or whatever, we're going to stand with what history say stop, right? Like that's the sort of notion that we ought to do things the way we used to. Progressivism isn't saying we ought to do necessarily a different way. It's just saying we ought to do something for the people on the margins, the lift people up who can't get those. And so the people who seem to me are open to rethinking are not the people who want government or want to thwart progress. People who should be thinking about this and need to be thinking about it are the people on, you're a journalist, so you're not okay, you're there we go.
What's the secret?
Here we go. So it's for us, right? Like the frustration that I have as a professional government is that we get in our own way. If you're a Republican and you go in and you muck up some bureaucracy, it doesn't look at you, then people say, man, government doesn't work. It's having your cake and eating it too. You've done a service. If you're a progressive, your goal is to make it so that government appears to work, so that people will give you a mandate to do more with it, and it actually needs work.
Is that, I mean, as a liberal, I to speak up for the conservatives here. I mean, is it true when we look at states like Florida or like Texas, their governments are doing much better at allowing housing production, allowing for renewable energy production. I understand what you're saying, especially at the federal level, that the way in which our federal politics has shaken out has often been that conservatives really benefit from government breakdown because it allows them to continuously reduce the ability of the big government to exist and reduce taxes and that's a big part of their project. But at the local level and the state level, government providing services or enabling services to exist doesn't seem like I mean, if I was an alien coming down and I was looking at the administration of cities in California versus Florida, I don't think I would come away with the belief that Californians are the ones who really care about government administration.
You know, I appreciate that. You have done earth-shattering work on the world of housing. But your book is on housing, your articles are on housing. I was in a conference in Arizona yesterday or last week, and I said like some 22-year-old came up to me, I'm doing an event next week in Jerusalem Demsas, New York, and he wrote me afterwards and he said, I can't believe that I was 1 degree away. Yeah, 1 degree away from the Jerusalem Demsas. So like.
You tell you as my little brother.
Yeah. Good, yeah, you should hear it. In the world of housing, I think that which I think is slightly different than from the world of linear infrastructure, building rails and wires. And I say that because of it. In the world of linear infrastructure, in the world of housing, the problem in most cases, and I'll let you correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to mansplain.
Here to man.
All right. My wife then. In the world of housing, the problem is that you have someone who owns a plot of land who wants to build a triplex or a 4-unit building on a single on a plot of land that's zoned for a single family, and the neighborhood won't allow that to happen. There's some process, a zoning process, a hearing process. In Rhode Island, even when you can build as of right, the neighbors are still allowed hearings as of right. I mean, all sorts of crazy. But in that case, you could choose either to say we're going to lift power up to some government bureaucracy that is going to now rule in the case of the landowner who wants to build on her own lot, or the neighborhood that does not want that larger building. Or you could say, you know what? She bought the land. She's got a plan that, like, everyone shut up, let her do what she's supposed to do. Conservatives would definitely take the latter, right? Like it's my property, I can do that. It's my gun, I can right. It's my plot of land. I can do what I want to do with it. Progressives are like the YIMBY progressives, your ilk, the people,
Your people,
the people for whom you speak in on housing and in many of your articles. They basically agree with that point of view. Like there is a Jeffersonian solution to the problem of housing scarcity, right? You could just say, let people do what they want to do on the plots of land that they own, and we would have a lot more housing. So like that is why, that is distinct from what happens in linear. And you're trying to build a high voltage power line across a whole variety of different properties, public lands, private lands, neighborhoods, central businesses, you name it, or a high-speed rail line that's going to go through various towns and across farmland and public park. Like there is no landowner who you can empower to make it happen, right? The people that are going to be affected don't own the land. There is no Jeffersonian solution to that problem. So the reason, in my view, that in the broader world of abundance or state capacity, supply-side progressivism or whatever, it's a series of terrible terms for this whole thing. Okay, I'm not blaming you. I'm just saying. One of someone in this room needs to come up with something better than what we've got. In the reason that housing is way ahead, and it's sort of at the tip of the spear, this whole thing, because there is a way, as progressives are wont to do since the 1970s, to push power down. It is much harder to figure out a solution where progressives who are averse to power and speak truth to power and are very suspicious of centralized establishment institutions will empower some bureaucracy to say, this is where high-speed rail line is going to be built, this is where we're going to connect these wind farms and solar farms, wind turbines and whatnot to the grid. That's what in the end we need to be able to do. And that's the thing. I mean, this gets back to the original question you asked. In the end, like there are realms of public policy. There is no substitute for centralized decision. There is no substitute for expression that the old establishment used to wield. We don't need to go back to that birth of discretion. It doesn't need to be Robert Moses II, but there needs to be some process by which someone exercises discretion about who's going to make these various decisions. And that is something that is something that I think the right should be doing. I mean, they do in certain realms. It's more complicated. I shouldn't say that. There are realms where right does want to be curious. I don't know if you know what I'm thinking of. Let's say that. But in general, they are suspicious of power in that way. But there's no substitute. If we're going to be able to build the infrastructure of tomorrow, we're going to need somebody who's able.
So I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to the answer, and I don't want to take this too far because I'm a real liberal, so.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you know, when I look at the private company that is Brightline, that is able to build. Wow, they have it, they're in the speakers.
Yeah.
Brightline is able to build, you know, a high-speed rail, but pretty fast passenger rail in Florida. When I look at utility scale solar, which is not just, you know, distributed, which is now Texas past California and building utility scale solar. And anti-renewables bills, which came up in the Texas House, defeated by the Republican Party to prevent the ability for to block renewable energy. And then I look at California, which has spent tens of billions of dollars on high-speed rail, which I would put all the money in my bank account will never exist because never get developed. It will never be a high-speed rail project that can exist. They don't even have the money. They have no idea where it comes from. At this moment. So when I look at this, it's not. I agree that there's the Jeffersonian solution has made these housing policies to pass with like Montana and Arizona and places where very much conservatives are on board because of their property rights perspective. But I think there needs to be more of a reckoning of liberalism about how Republicans have made government work better on some of these issues in their own state. And I wonder if that is a perspective that has carried anything for you, or if you're pretty much in the camp of they're not going to solve our transition problem. That's not a way.
I mean, well, first of all, I would say from your mouth to God's ears or Democrats' ears, or like if they're doing stuff that we want done, we shouldn't castigate them. Like we should brace them for it. We should also, there was a big permitting bill that died in the hands of progressives at the end of the Biden administration. Manchin Barresso was the name of it. Like that died because the left turned against it for the most part. Like that's on us. And I guess my view is like when we can work with them, let's do it. Right. If they're willing to embrace these advances, let's do it. In most cases, I bet we'll find disagreements on the margins. Like there are going to be moments where we think that there should be some more opportunity for people who are worried about environmental implications to bring those to light, or that it shouldn't be game of cost. It shouldn't be that if you're building a new transmission line, it always goes through the neighborhood, the poorest housing, or the cheapest housing. And we can argue for those things with the margins, but you are certainly right that we as Democrats ought to be fighting for programs that deliver. And if there are things that we can steal or borrow or collaborate on in Florida and Texas, we ought to be taking a look at that rather than bashing our heads against the wall, not understanding why adding more checks and balances system won't deliver California to the right future.
I wanna leave time for,
You want to take a question?
we do want to question, okay, so, okay, well.
No, can it.
Okay, I have one more question, then folks, if you have questions, get ready, I will call on you. You previewed this in your, or one of your earlier answers, but one of the groups that has become most virulently, or factions in democratic parties are most virulently opposed to the abundance movement space, have been a lot of folks who work on antitrust and anti-corporate power, policy and politics, and, you know, reading your book actually makes you feel like not surprised that that's the case, and I wonder, and especially your previewed this a little bit about the stolen plank in the progressive movement, and wondering if were you surprised by the level of backlash from this faction? B, does that kind of explain it? Does that story explain it? If so, can you tell it?
Well, the story in 1912 is that the reformers who are trying to get Theodore Roosevelt to embrace a super juiced Sherman Antitrust Act managed to get that language into the Press Party platform in Chicago. And it is read to the plenary the next morning and given to the newspapers. And then the guy who's basically financing the whole thing is like a rich JP Morgan's right-hand man. And he apparently storms out of the plenary as to be read sick. And a few hours later, the communications director for the convention goes to the office and says that provision, that plank of the platform was inserted in error. And then all the subsequent newspapers around the country, they apologize for the misprint and pull it out. And so it seems like this guy with his deep pockets manages to get the antitrust portion of the platform and out. And so that is sort of, you're absolutely right. That's sort of an earlier incarnation of the current fight that you're seeing on Twitter or Blue Sky.
I'm gonna call that now.
Fair enough.
That's important.
Fair enough. So, so you are seeing that. I am not surprised that people are so wrapped up in their aversion to power. Like, you know, if you are brought up into politics believing that there is real menace, centralized power, it is hard to hear your peers in the movement you love say, truly, we've overdone the degree to which we put the screws on the establishment. And so I am not surprised that people are reacting. The thing that I would say to them is, you know, I'm not a Medicare for all guy, but if I were, I would recognize that Medicare for all, or having some larger role for government in the healthcare system, is predicated on people believing that government works. And it's very hard to imagine population embracing more government in education or healthcare. All these different ones want there to be more healthcare. When their basic view of government is the view that New Yorkers had of Bay Koch's Parks. Like, if the government is not able to deliver better healthcare, got the lousiest trains, you know, in the developed world. If we can't take, like, got plentiful clean energy all around us, but we can't build the wires that would actually use it to replace fossil. Like, if government is broken in all these realms, we need to fix that before we ask more of people to invest in public authority generally. And so, you know, like the Matt Stoller's, I don't want to name them and
Name them.
yeah, name them. I like whether they are whether they're arguing in good faith or not. The truth is, I think that we all have some notion that government is not doing all it can to help those margins. And if we're going to get there, we need to make sure government does. So I'd like to leave my comments.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. I'm not really sure how much time, but Eric will cut us off.
All right.
I wonder if you could say more about,
You want a mic or you're good?
can you hear? If you could say more about what obstacles that are now placed on government you would like to see eliminated? Like what kinds of things do you think are kind of unnecessary in our structure?
Yeah, I think you made reference to this earlier, like, I mean, the classic example that I think probably has gotten flawed a little too much because it's not necessarily as big a deal as we made it out to be, is something called the National Environmental Policy Act, passed in 1970, signed by Richard Nixon, which was meant to be just simply a law that required engineers who were building highways or doing things with public dollars to have conversations with themselves in the hallway about what are the environmental implications, and has grown to be metastasized into this requirement that says that if the government is not studying every single aspect of a project, that they can be sued from the outside for having failed to look. And like the classic example back here in New York is the West Side Highway, or Westway is what it's called. It's interesting. No one, the story should be done of what Westway was going to be. It was basically going to make it so that the Manhattan went right to the Hudson River. And then below ground level, there would be a highway running. It's like Oslo. Now we've got, instead of that, we still have the West Side Expressway, and the West Side Route, whatever it is.
Listen,
The West Side Highway, and like, you still can't get, like, the pedestrians still have to cross, whatever it is, 18 lanes of traffic to get to that was sort of an early case of NEPA, environmental impact statements. The fact is, the Army Corps was supposed to build the new highway, did not consider a judge, did not properly consider the effect on some sort of fish, and so the entire thing got scotched. And like in housing, in all the places, it's not just NEPA. We have a acquaintance, Eli Dorado, from center right, who just wants to repeal the law. I don't actually think that would have that dramatic effect, because there are all sorts of other things that now, but NEPA is sort of one example of a spirit of progressive lawmaking that began in the late 60s and that's flourished now for years, and it's just layer upon layer upon layer. And the question is not, there are those who, and again, I think this is a conversation that our movement needs to have. There are those who just want to pull all of those things away and make it so that there are categorical exemptions for very expensive projects, or that housing should be built as a right, or ministerial is a word that Scott Wiener uses. I don't exactly understand what the words mean, but and my view is, in some cases that's right. Other cases, I think people ought to have some ability to speak back to the entity that wants to build the housing, the rail line, or whatever it is. They just didn't have a veto over. And so when I say I want reforms, is that I want there not to be proverbial vetoes in the system everywhere.
Good plug for the book Fighting Westwood, by the way, which is all that.
Yeah.
And is that guy in the?
I think that George, I think it's at Georgetown.
Okay.
I think everyone's known.
Yeah.
But no, the thing about Westway is the money that was earmarked for that ended up coming to the MTA to get new rail cars, so we're actually quite bad.
I did moderator privilege. Part of the reason that NEPA is taking so much heat is that the actual problem are state and local regulations of what people who are in DC have little control over, and so they try to find something they can actually work on. But state and local NEPAs are hugely binding. The Minnesota version of NEPA prevented, delayed for a significant amount of time, newly elected, debated, tons of community input decision by the Minneapolis City Council to end single family zoning, to end parking requirements, et cetera, as a result of a law that was never going to do this. They've now reformed that law to make it impossible for it to apply to comprehensive plans that they were actually dealing with. But there are tons of these regulations. I mean, you're seeing across the entire country, localities using setback requirements to essentially make it impossible for wind farms to build. To say like, oh, you can build wind farms as long as each wind farm is 1,000 yards away from each other wind turbine. And so then it's like no one would ever develop in that way. So all of these regulations, I mean, people think it's really easy to just say like, oh, let's just go through them. But I think with housing, it can be easier because you could literally just control F to leave parking minimums, to leave minimum lot sizes, et cetera. But with all these other ones, it will require, I think, state centralization to say, okay, we need to build wind. Where do we want the area to be developed for wind? How are we gonna have a process to allow for people to bid on those projects? But in general, I think these environmental regulations, these kinds, in particular, like of these process-oriented ones, are quite bad. Notably, things like the Clean Air Act and Water Act are very different because they're standards-based. They don't say we're going to litigate some insane process, because also as an individual, like I don't know how it's supposed to turn out. These are scientific experts need to debate whether there's going to be a harm to like me or my children's health, et cetera, as we pursue these policies. But the Clean Air and Clean Water Act just said there's a standard for what clean water is, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, and we can find that standard. We're going to define it. Obviously, it's defined by people. It's not like derived from like any kind of standard of clean air. We have cleaner air. But those kinds of laws I think are much better than the process oriented. But next question.
D Jerusalem.
I'm gonna like yeah.
Oh. Pressure. All right, David, I'm gonna go to you.
Okay, and I'm gonna I'll echo what Eric said. The Westway money is in the subway. Richard Ravitch put it there, but I wanted you both to talk about the state capacity to actually deliver efficiently and quality in terms of public services. In Jerusalem, you've made the point on, Texas, Florida, they're doing great stuff, which is true in terms of quantity of housing production, but there's a whole suite of public services where frankly, I wouldn't trade my libraries or my parks, state parks or local parks here in New York, or for that matter, our transit system for the counterparts on the edge of Fort Worth, because they're not doing that, right? So there's that aspect. And then Mark, where this attitude, which is deeply held, and you exhibit it yourself in the disparagement of the DMV, the government can't do it. To what extent is it real? To what extent is it something that's been inculcated in us? I was curious specifically about the DMV. I go to DMV every 8 years, whatever. I've never had a problem.
It's amazing.
And I deal in terms of dealing with my private sector cable company. And I recently had to register my business. I spent 15 minutes on the Secretary of State's website in New York, Albany. Bam, it's done. I compare that to dealing with my private sector health insurance claim form. So this idea that private sectors are, somewhat superior in performance, I don't think it actually is true always. It isn't necessarily true. Could you both talk about justifying and giving government the ability to hire, retain, compensate people who can build trains like Brightline?
No.
Okay, great. I think there are a few things in there. One is this question of private sector versus public sector. So I think it's notable that you pick two private sector areas where there's tons of regulations. They're highly regulated industries. Both the cable companies and the health insurance markets are not private. I don't think they should be. Like that's not what but I think it's important that there's massive government intervention in these markets. They are not actually operating, and many people within the doctors as well, nurses, practitioners, activists, will note that many of these regulations do prevent them from being able to provide cost-cutting services. For instance, and this is another instance of an interest group preventing better outcomes in healthcare. The local state AMAs repeatedly will lobby against the ability for nurses to increase their scope of practice to be able to do very basic things like take care of your primary care appointment, et cetera, because that reduces the wage pressure up on doctors. So the American Medical Association is contributing right now to stopping state legislatures from allowing their healthcare costs to go lower. Like a nurse take your temperature, weighing you, you need to have a doctor for most of those meetings, and unless you have something specific you're talking to them about, but it's hugely costly for that to happen. So this is another instance. I mean, and I don't think this is a central problem with healthcare costs, but I do think these things do end up having an impact that is important to note. But I think on your first question to me about, I wouldn't trade Fort Worth for New York City, a lot of people are.
Oh, I know.
You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that's important. Like, I agree with you. Like, I personally, as someone who like loves living in cities, like, it would take a lot of money to force me to live in a place that was not urban walkable. Like, it would be at a level of like destitution where I had to make that choice. But I think when we look at migratory patterns in the United States, I mean, the place we should the best out on this is the California out migration. The number one reason people leave California is not taxes, it's not wokeness, Elon Musk or anything like that. It is housing costs. And it is these people who are leaving for Phoenix, for Texas, et cetera. And so I agree that the amenity package for many people I mean, that's why New York City remains a place where many people try to live regardless. Washington DC, Boston, all these places, because many people are willing to pay the premium for both the employment options and the cultural benefits that exist. But to me, I think it's more walk before you can run. Like, yes, it would be really great if, as well as developing a bunch of houses in single family tracts in in Texas and in Georgia, they also developed like very nice parks, et cetera, blah, blah. But also, like, when I've gone to Louisiana, I've gone to Florida, the market pressure from developers has been to create mixed-use villages in many of these places. Like, I'm always surprised when I go there, but it's very funny. I was in Louisiana and I was walking around the like very new developed, like it's like, it's a coffee shop, and there's some townhomes, there's a bike path or whatever, right? But most of the area is, of course, single family home tracts. And the name of the new development was like the old time village or something like that. And I was just like, well, I guess if we like, make it, about return to tradition, for development, and get conservatives on board with mixed use urbanism. To me, like, I think that for me, a lot of my work has been, especially as a liberal coming into this space and writing a lot about this, has been the realization that in many cases, the conservative states are really actually doing some of the best work on public provision of resources. I mean, we're seeing education too. Louisiana, Mississippi, their ability to educate low-income Black and Brown students has now surpassed that of Massachusetts, Maryland. And like, these are areas where, again, there are interest groups that have lobbied against things like phonics and science of reading for various reasons, and that has led to degraded public services. So I think there has to be a real reckoning within liberalism that, like, no, it's not random, no, it's not hope. We have failed to provide the public services we need.
I mean, I think I'm glad that you had a terrific experience with DMV and that you were able to re-register your company on the website quickly. I mean, we are here at the Marron Institute, right? And like the Eric and Elon and their team can cite you chapter and verse on how we're spending, several times X what they're spending in other developed economies to build, similar or not even as good infrastructure. Like, there's just no, like, I just don't think that that's good government. And we should, like, it shouldn't be that the Second Avenue subway for what we spent on it stops at whatever it is, 96th Street. It should be going through to poor communities in the Bronx. Like, we should have already done that. There are lots of things that we ought to be doing. And so I think to the question of, is the first of all, my book title is a lie because some things work, right? Like I will admit it. Not everyone bowls alone, and some work. So it's up something, but there's a lot that doesn't. And if progressives aren't willing to grapple with the fact that, like, there's this housing crisis that Jerusalem is the world's foremost expert on. There's like Eric has shown light on the degree to which we're just in the dark ages when it comes to being able to build infrastructure efficiently. I mean, you read a book like Superpower, which is Russell Gold's explaining an effort by a progressive energy developer to try to build a high voltage transmission line from the panhandle of Oklahoma, where there's lots of in the Tennessee Valley Authority and across Arkansas, and like he starts at the beginning of the Obama administration and gives up after those 8 years. Like, there's just too many examples of government not working for us to sort of sheathe ourselves in some notion that we, it's just that Russell Vaught and Grover Norquist and Ronald Reagan had it all wrong and lied to the American people or what's the matter with cancer? These people are just fools who can't see how great Social Security works. Social Security is a miracle. Just to think for a moment of what Social Security does every month to send out these checks, and incredible with what Medicare did when to eliminate people living in poverty and worried about their health and old age. These are miraculous programs, and you're probably right that more newspaper stories that. Jerusalem should write more stories where she just writes, yet again, the Social Security Administration gets out a gazillion checks and they're basically all. You all have to click on the right. But I think we ought to be honest with ourselves about the things we're doing really poorly. And I feel like in the same way that I wanted to give Donald Trump a big parade for rebuilding Pullman Rink, we ought to own that, accept it, and not try to say, yeah, but the DMV was a lot, it actually wasn't that bad to go to the DMV.
So, Jerusalem, you may have prefigured my question with your remark about the Great Migration from California to Texas. But 30 years ago, I was on a flight from San Francisco to Houston, and my seatmate, who may as well have been with the Houston Chamber of Commerce, was talking about how terrible the nanny state of San Francisco was. And he was telling me that Houston was the greatest city on earth. And I remember this, said, because you could build a nickel smelter next to an orphanage. And I said, okay, but why would you want to do that? Question is, between the poles of California and Texas, is there any place you think that is getting it right? You mentioned Louisiana and Georgia as examples of where they've enabled development, but there are some, let's say, downsides to governance in those states. Is there anywhere in this country that you think has the right mix where they're able to do development and is a place you might want to live?
Firstly, I think the Houston story is, I think, badly sold by your seatmate there. Houston's, greatest achievement has been the essential elimination of street homelessness at a time where homelessness has been increasing. And it has done so by the large availability of rental housing. And so Homeless Services was able to place, I think this is actually a way to marry your two questions here. Los Angeles County Homeless Services houses 220 something people every single day, and yet 10 more than that, 230 something, these numbers are wrong, but generally correct, 230 something are falling into homelessness at the same time. In Houston, when they house 200 people, they don't have that constant flow out as an issue in homelessness, and so they're able to actually present their homelessness problem in a way that Los Angeles cannot, because of its dearth of rental housing. Honestly, to me, I think it's hard because I think my entire view about housing is that there are a lot of people with different preference structures about how they want to organize their lives. People who want to live with their parents, who hate to have their parents living with them. There are people who want to live in a community with multiple people of the same age, who want to have 10 children in a house. Some people who want to have 1 child in the house. And to me, and the point of saying that is the point is to create a diversity of housing typologies that allow for people to make those choices as freely as possible. And so a place like Houston has allowed that for a large segment, but you're right, government's not just about stepping out of the way and saying let the market rip, it's about enabling people the provision of public services. But I think Houston can be bettered by having more lovely parks like Central Park, etc. And if I were to pick places that I can imagine myself living that do better than others, they often are places that have just not had to face the types of population pressures yet that a New York or San Francisco has. So for instance, Colorado has started passing a good number of laws, and still nowhere near enough, but it's kind of new to the big development pressure game and when compared to places like SF. But honestly, Montana and Texas, the most recent legislative session in Texas, I guess Washington is maybe the only blue state, which I would put inside of the same tranche of places that have really tried to pass serious housing production legislation. But there's not really a place doing it in the United States. And I want to be clear here, there are a lot of countries that are way more socialized than we are that manage to build a lot of these kinds of infrastructure projects way faster. It's not just a question of, markets getting to do whatever they want and therefore you can fix the problem. Again, we've now referenced Eric's work like so many times. He's not paying us, don't worry. But Eric's work shows that you can see.
Hey, wait a minute.
We're getting paid.
No, it didn't hurt me to yourself.
There are these countries where there's a lot more, like there are tons of environmental regulations, there are tons of labor protections, unions have a much higher union density, they're still able to do it. And it's a harder problem in those situations with trust, where they have higher trust in government in those places than we do. And so I think the hard question is in America, can you reverse that trust? Like, can you actually do something about that? And if not, is the only solution, especially in housing, to just let the market rip? Is the reason why Texas and Montana are going to do better on this because they've accepted there's not a lot of trust in government, and so they're going to let the private market do what it can. And liberals need to either accept that or fix the trust problem. But this middle thing where we kind of like don't do either is no.
Hi, Alex Olmowicz, Cannon Center. Thank you guys. I wanted to ask, to what extent Robert Moses is always used as the avatar of expertise. And I think he was an amazing engineer, but I think he would have been a C- like urban economist, kind of like urban and spatial econ. Everyone's like, this was expertise, or like rationalist high modernism in the kind of seeing like a state thing. But then it's like, he never actually did the math. There's no spreadsheet where they wrote down how many lanes you need to get everyone to drive to Midtown between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. in rush hour. Like the Manhattan Expressway was not that big. And it was like, if we're all going to shut down the MTA, in other words, like it's supposed to be expertise, but actually the math was terrible. And so like, to what extent was part of the problem like fake expertise, or like also then like Corbusier and rationalizing like urban spaces? Like for Corbusier, it was about like the lines being straight on the map from overhead, but like that's like untreated OCD, not actually expertise. Like that, and so like, what I mean is like, there was no social benefit cost analysis. There were no spreadsheets. Like even the expertise then was kind of vibes. So like, to what extent was that the problem and the failure? And that actually when we get the details right, that's the important part of figuring it out.
This is a question. I want to answer this in a funny way. Eric has a paper out about that includes a story that I'm just thinking about it all the time these days. When the MTA was building the Second Avenue subway, they needed a place to stage the equipment. And they saw that along near the Second Avenue subway was the Marx Brothers playground, which was owned or operated by the Parks Department. And went to the Parks Department and said, can we use this land to put the big equipment we're going to use? And the Parks Department said, sure, but at this cost. And then some terrible markup, right? Of like, well, you're gonna have to rebuild. Yeah, I mean, right, which is then gonna be passed on, and the MTA is gonna have to cover it. And I'm just, it's so interesting because I don't know how to solve for that problem, right? I don't know how to solve for the problem of don't want to give the MTA carte blanche to use parks to park their equipment whenever they want, because you can imagine that they would just always do it and leave it there forever, like scaffolding, right, all over New York. And you also don't want to have it so that the Parks Department, which owns the only real estate where it's possible to stage the equipment affordably, is able to, wield so much power over the MTA, which needs to do this thing. So what is the process you would use to make that decision? And I don't have a perfect answer. The thing that Robert Moses was good at was choosing, right? Like that was the secret sauce of the Moses era, was that he wielded discretion. And if the Parks Department had said that to him, he would have had some backroom power move to use to make it so that if the Parks Department did that to him, he was gonna, take the top third of Central Park and turn it into a bus station. Like he would have figured out some leverage on them to make it so that it was possible. So you're right that the notion is that he was an expert and perhaps, if there were better scientists and he could do algorithms and there were, AI and he could ask Grok what needed to be built and what shouldn't be built and how many lanes and et cetera, that we might have come up with things, but when I say scientific expertise, et cetera, what I mean is that he coalesced enough power and made a case, that seemed rational and was at least centralized, was certainly more centralized than had the Tammany bosses simply chosen between what the needs were of their local block, block. Whatever, the little minions of the Tammany machine. And so I think I take some of your points. Lewis Mumford, that whole generation of urban developers probably didn't know the answers. But the essential difference between what happened today and what happened then was that at that point the establishment had discretion to make choices, and now they are completely without it.
I think we have time for just a few more questions, maybe 2 or 3.
Thanks, Eric. Paul Salama. I was most recently at Cornell Tech doing work on an automating environmental review. So fun with this crowd. I guess in terms of, we haven't gotten too much of like how to bring it back side of your title. And okay. Some false advertising. I don't know. Well, I guess I'm stuck with this question of like, is it kind of a political movement or is it a political science question of like we need better representation, or is it a kind of technocratic kind of to follow on there to say, we just need to make better decision making? Is there this kind of third way? I guess there's a second question of like, is there a third way between the Hamiltonian, Jeffersonian of like just making the right decisions, and we need to, or is it you need to make one decision either way?
Everyone should have a voice, but no one should have a veto. So we've gone from a place where everyone was screaming at Moses to stop on the cross Bronx, and he turned it a deaf ear, so no one had a voice, to a place where almost any of those people today would have been able to veto the project. And somewhere between those two extremes is some sort of process, in my view, where the people who are going to be affected by new housing development, new linear infrastructure, have an opportunity to speak to the people who are actually going to exercise discretion in choosing the way forward. I think that would vary from one realm to the next. There's no single bill that I think Congress can pass. The point of the book is that, presuming that most people in this room are progressives, I don't think that we've been thinking about that generally. That we see some project that we don't like, and our reflexive response is there ought to be a law that makes it so that we can't have, nickel smelting next to schools.
Keep
Right?
that law.
Yeah, right. Right, or I don't like the way this streetscape looks, I'm going to sue. Our impulse is, when we don't like the decision, is to attack the process and add layers. I want at least progressives to think to themselves, is it that the process was broken, or is it that I just don't particularly like this particular outcome and the process is fine, I just lost. I want us to be open to that possibility. And so generally, I think that there should be expedited review. Like we should be thinking about what are the various reviews when someone has the germ of an idea to when something's approved. But what is the process of can we maintain the ability for people for us not to build on Indian burial grounds and not to not to throw smog into an elementary school and that, right? I think that there should be checks on these things. I just don't think that we should presume that adding more checks in all situations will get us to a better outcome. That's where I'm trying to drive.
Say one quick thing, which is just, a few years ago, Spencer Cox, the governor of Utah, made a joke in a press conference where he said, Californians don't come here where things are growing too quickly. And I asked him, and I asked also Jared Polis of Colorado, like, hey, do you guys think that, population growth is good? Do you think growth is good? And both of them like hedge like, oh, obviously you want economic growth, but there's some fancy road center. And I said to both of them, if I'd asked any political official that question 40 years ago, they would have been confused by the question. Like, growth is good. Of course growth is good. Like, we're dying for growth. Like, it's a horrible curse not to have economic growth, population growth, et cetera. Just the value of the political part of the question is there needs to be an orientation within everyone's brain that these things are positive, that even like within liberals, right? We haven't talked about this. We talk about immigration and housing, like it's like everyone needs to do their fair share. Like, you guys have to do the sacrifice, have the homeless people have shelter on your, like, these are not sad, like, these are positive things. There's no homelessness on your street, there's shelter.
Only there was an agenda.
Yes, it's only there with an agenda. So I think that the point of the political side is to reorient people more against like in this way, because people should have a reflexive, positive view. Like, yes, housing's great, and let's make sure there's not stormwater runoff. Make sure everyone does the checks, and there's like someone who's in charge of making sure housing quality is in charge. Like, the first thought liberals have when they hear about new infrastructure is all the list of negatives, and that to me is the value of the political movement that's developing now. We say like, let's face it back. Let's go to places in this country or in this world that suffer from low population and economic growth. They are horrible places. The people there would give anything. I mean, the biggest problem in governing in the world is how you do economic growth. And the places in this country that get it by the spades are like crying about it. And it's like shocking. And so to me, like, there's technocratic solutions here. I mean, I'm glad you're working on this. I think there are a lot of things you could do about how to actually aggregate people's preferences. Like, local polling is quite difficult, both expensive if local governments can't do it, but also can you really get at these questions through polling in a way that's valuable to policymakers, but having some way of actually reaching people and figuring out like, oh, there's real strong preferences around this specific route versus that specific route, and it's actually equal cost. So let's just pick the route that's less costly. There are ways we can aggregate stuff through technocratic means that would be helpful. But largely, I mean, my perspective on this is not shared by everyone, is that most of these problems are just political will, that the technocratic solutions will flow. Like, it's not confusing to build an apartment building. We know how to build solar. There are countries in the world that are way poorer, way less educated than us that build rapid rail transit all the time. So to me, it's, do we want it to happen? And then everything will flow from that.
One here, and then there'll be one more question.
Okay. All right, I'll make this quick. There's a bit of banter online about the blue city and red state formula, where the story goes, the red states in a few decades ago, banned inclusionary zoning and a bunch of these different ways that cities could procure finances. And now the blue cities are passing up zoning, they're doing well. Is this something you've heard? Is it something you believe in? And do you know of anybody doing a kind of like historical view on how the institutions in Atlanta and Austin, Dallas, Nashville, whatever, evolved to this point today?
So I am apparently not online enough to be able to answer that with any authority.
I'm not sure what this talking about, and I feel like I know all the discourse. Wait, can you explain that again? What is that?
I mean, like compared to Blue City in okay, compared to Blue City and Blue City Bay Area, take a Nashville, take Austin, take Atlanta. These are places where it's mostly Democratic, but they're willing to try these reforms. And particularly, I think when people talk about Austin's upzoning, there's this talk that Texas banned inclusionary housing at a state level. The state legislature did this. And therefore, without ways to extract revenue in the past, the current Austin representatives are more willing to look at growth as a way to finance it.
So essentially this idea, the state preemption on inclusionary zoning and on rent control in Republican-led states is pretty prevalent. So I think most Republican states have banned rent control, and many have banned inclusionary zoning. And the idea is, as a result, their local Democratic elected officials have been forced to pass better upzonings rather than rely on the clutches of of just rent control and inclusionary zoning trying to solve these problems. I think there's definitely something to that. But I would also say like the political cultures of these cities are very different. When you're in a state where you're outnumbered by conservatives as a liberal, there's a lot more, and you're like, there's no path to power without dealing with the fact that many people in your state just disagree with you. I think that requires a lot more pragmatism to get things done. And there's almost like a, I don't know if it's like, there's like a market discipline for political officials in places where their views are in the minority. And in places like California, where people's views are often the majority, you don't really get that disciplining factor of like, you could lose elections as like a Democrat, not just like you individually as a person, but like your party could be like wiped out. Like in Austin, it is very plausible for someone who's a conservative to become city council. I can even imagine a mayor that was quite conservative getting elected. And so yeah, I think there is something very much to what you're talking about.
One more question over here.
So I'm stuck on your statement that there's really no Jeffersonian solution to the sort of linear infrastructure problem, right? Because there are solutions and we've seen them in a variety of ways. So for example, and they're basically property rights solutions, but instead of having a single property owner, right, we unitize. So bids are an example, or there's been a proposal for a long time to have RIDs, residential districts, right? Where a majority decides, right? Everybody has voice, but a majority decides whether or not the house that we were talking about gets built. Or you do that for a railroad line or vast oil fields in Texas use unitization type of devices. But it really makes you go back, and I think this is partly building on Paul's question, it really makes you go back to, well, what do we mean by democracy? What do we mean by voice, right? And why isn't that enough voice, right? You go with the majority.
So, yeah, I'm not trying to hawk my book here, but
That's actually
but the beginning of chapter 8 is the story of an effort to get highest voltage rail line from Quebec, which has a sort of clean water power, hydro, into Massachusetts, which does not border Canada. So you have to go through New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, one of them. And it's about the fight the Mainers have to say, we don't want Massachusetts' big bill, the big transmission line through our forests, through our towns, across our Appalachian Trail, gorge, and I don't know how you would unitize that. Let's talk afterward if you've got an idea about what happens when all of these towns that are along the corridor where the line would have to go, vote against it. Right? Like, I don't know what the Democratic solution is to say, like, there's no amount of money that you're going to be able to pay these towns that's going to make them feel good that there's a high voltage rail line going near their child's elementary school. And so maybe there is a democratic solution in the sense that you could have a statewide plenary, and that, but they did that and it lost, right? And I'm not sure, but one of the two of us on this stage wrote an article said actually community input is bad. It wasn't me. And she said right. She said right. Jerusalem Demsas right. And I will, and so that is the reason that I'm dubious of the Jeffersonian solution to the problem. I do think there's a solution to the problem. I just think that it is that you need to have somebody say, look, if we're going to reduce carbon emissions in the aggregate, some people are going to have to make decisions that other people don't like. And that to me is more Hamiltonian than it is Jeffersonian. But I would, believe me, there is nothing more that I would like to do than debate this while my wife is not in town, because she does not want to hear any more about it. So we'll talk about it after this.
Well, thank you, Mark.
You can probably pester them for a bit. I don't know what they're up to. I'm gonna get some cookies and tea. I didn't get to have any. Thank you all for coming. If you have questions, linger, ask me questions, ask them questions. I think that's actually a Hamiltonian solution you just described, to be honest, the way it's described. So, but that's, I guess, not at all.